Hello, everyone, and welcome. I know it has my mundane name. I cannot change that on my listing, but my name is Mara Palmer in the SCA. I'm a Scribal Laurel out of Meridies with primary focuses on calligraphy and on period materials. So the central reference piece for this discussion will be this scroll that I did for an augmentation of arms for Sabine, but I will dip into old pictures and examples that I've kind of gathered over the years, mostly because I didn't want to retake some of the pictures. Okay, introduction, recipient and exemplar. On the right is the entirety of the information I was given regarding the recipient's persona, time, location, and other details. And this is often more information than most scribes will get at all. The most common I've gotten is generally along the lines of Viking-ish, or they wear a lot of Elizabethan. This is the nature of hunting for persona-appropriate exemplars, and it's often considered a luxury when this information is so often lacking. So just this much is considered a luxury. This is also why scribes love people who include persona information in their recommendation letters. When I began my search, it quickly became clear that there were not many exemplars from that time and place, and definitely none with the visual pop that we strive to have for SCA Scrolls. This is a recurring setback for scribes, especially in the many cultures that don't have traditional manuscripts or in periods where manuscripts were not particularly flashy. One easy workaround is exploring alternative materials and inspirations. The three ways I typically do this is firstly motif inspiration, like taking art and motifs from like a Roman vase and painting that as illumination. Secondly, just painting the thing, like if stone carvings are all there is, but their motif doesn't paint out well for a scroll, I'll sometimes literally just paint a rock that is carved accordingly. And you can do this for things like jewelry and other artifacts as well. And the third is what I call stuffed scrolls, where I will paint the scroll text onto an object like axes, gauntlets, shields, ink bottles, that sort of thing. And another approach is to expand your search to include exemplars that, while not originating from that specific period or location, are still culturally relevant or significant. The other workaround is to expand the time period or location. Try to aim for only one major shift. If the location is important to the person, shift the period a bit. Or same overall empire, but a vassal on the edges, which was my approach for this scroll. But even expanding my search to the entirety of the Merovingian dynasty, which is 41 to 751 CE, there weren't a lot of available examples with good visual variety, even allowing for manuscripts produced at the absolute edges of the Forest Kingdoms in parts of Germany and Liechtenstein. The search was also limited by organizations that had digitized their manuscripts, a disappointingly small percentage of most collections, unfortunately, and had databases for those digitized manuscripts that were searchable to the public. In my search, I found the Vatican's copy of Sacramentarium. I think it's Galatianum, Reglat 316. It's a French manuscript produced from 701 to 725 CE, and is considered the most important surviving Merovingian illuminated manuscript. The manuscript contained multiple carpet pages to pull from for inspiration. While all these pages were used for gaining familiarity with the motifs, colors, and calligraphy used in this manuscript, the primary pages used for the left and right sides of the scroll were 131V and 173R respectively. So these two pages. Later in the presentation, I'll address making changes to further personalize the scroll to the recipient. So part one, use of period materials. This will be the bulkiest part of this presentation because we can't discuss how to make allowances for SCA needs without having a strong foundation of the period materials out there. The predominant page material at the time was parchment. Animal hide scraped and stretched until thin. The best is super smooth and was worked on with a slant, sometimes as high as 80 degrees. This was only made possible by all the other materials used and is difficult to translate into paper and metal nib work. It is important to keep your parchment in as little humidity as possible, and I know I'm saying that as someone who lives in Georgia, but it helps prevent the buckling and the bowing. If it is buckled or if it gets bent, place it between baking paper, sometimes called parchment paper, actually, essentially wax paper minus the wax. Put it under a bunch of heavy books. Use larger books for the base if you can, or lay down some cardboard before placing the books on the parchment to prevent creasing from the books being side by side. If your parchment gets wet, dry it off immediately, press it under some heavy books, and pray it doesn't ripple or buckle. This piece had some pretty significant buckling even after treating it. It was actually a lot worse. What you don't see is the crease from where the mail carrier bent it in half. Personally, I'll take buckling over a crease. But this can be difficult to frame, which is why it was sitting in my supplies for so long. But the recipient used to do professional framing, so I knew this parchment was safe in her hands. While there are several people I get parchment from, my go-to mass producer of medievally prepared parchment is Master David de Rossier Blanc, who prepared the parchment used on this scroll. Pounce was a powder that treated the parchment, absorbing the oils. While there is some documentation for chalk, the primary pounce was made from bones, specifically fowl wing bones, sometimes fish, that are aged and put in the fire until they're white. They were then powdered, pestle and mortar. They crumble pretty easily once they're all the way through. And then you put it in a little cloth wrap. Unlike Bristol and other papers, which are highly absorbent, any oils or residues will just sit on the top of the parchment or the pergamenata, meaning that when you try to apply ink or paint, it will either not take it at all, or it'll make you think it took it and then chip it off later, which is always super fun to discover when you think it's done. You can always apply pounce by sprinkling it on and spreading it around with a cloth or the feather remnants on your quill, or you can put it in some linen, tie it off, tap it along your page. Some people leave the pounce on there, but I prefer to brush it off either with some clean cloth or feather remnants on the back of the quill. So once you treat your page, it makes life a lot easier to lay down cloth or paper between the page and where your hands will touch the page. In period, they would have a prop or hand rest if working on a flatter inclined work surface, but often I find it's not necessary when working at that 80-degree slant, a table slant, as your hand simply just doesn't fall that way into that position. A lead tin stylus was the period analog, well, one of them, for the modern pencil. There's a fair amount of documentation for charcoal, but this seems to be limited to rough sketches or earlier pieces since it could affect the pH of the parchment and could lead to color shifts in inks and paints. It could also leave permanent smudges. The lead tin stylus became much more common later with a 2-to-1 lead to tin ratio. Unlike other metal point styli, it didn't require a coarse surface, though pounce definitely helped. You will find that a lot of the modern ones are a little bit harder because they have a higher ratio of tin. So while the tuft of a feather left on the back of the quill could be used to kind of like brush light lines and remove the pounce, it didn't work as well on the lead tin stylus. Several sources recommended using a bit of bread to smudge the lines away, which I tried and it worked, but you do need to make sure to repounce the area. I had found a basic rye bread to be the most effective. And then this is just an example of me using it on a different scroll, along with the modern lead tin stylus that I have, which I think it's 1 to 5 lead to tin instead of 2 to 1 lead to tin. And then my quote unquote straight edge, which is some borders for when you put down flooring, but it did the trick and it was beveled on one side so I could have it raised off the page and still have the straight lines. So here are some of my progress pictures for this scroll for the sketching portion, looking at overall comparison to the exemplar and including the adjustments I made to the images to be able to see the lines better. We'll talk about the tweaks I made later. And here's the sketch phase of the whole scroll. And here you'll also notice something that I didn't notice until I was done inking, which is that I had left out the O in Orleans. I had the D, but not the O. So I ended up having to put that in later, and luckily it ended up working with the kind of stacking style that we get with this kind of with these kind of lettering. And then a little closer in on each side. So for the letters that weren't blocked in ink, so those middle two lines, I still sketched out the basic letter shape to help me remember and also help with spacing. That's something you'll see a little bit in some period manuscripts, but it's not always something you have. It's just, it was my little cheat to make sure I had the space I needed to get the words in there. So while reed pens were used in early calligraphy and their use was continued for practicing throughout the period, there's no competing, in my opinion, with the feather quill. The most common feather used for calligraphy was the goose feather, though others could definitely be used. For point work, like lining, a crow quill was used, which, as the name suggests, was originally cut from a crow's feather. These were smaller on average, but still rigid. Those small goose feathers were certainly used as well. Excuse me, if you buy crow feathers, I suggest buying them from Europe. The keratin content is higher in European varieties, and I have had crow quills cut from the feathers of American varieties cave in during use. So these feathers were typically cured by heat or simply time, though there is a debate on the order of cutting and treating. Even the primary sources disagree. My personal preference is to soak the feathers, cut off the tip, gut them, let them soak a little more, cure them, then cut them. I have noticed that the curing post-cutting can sometimes lead to curling. We'll get into more specifics on cutting in the next slides, but before we move on, I wanted to point out the slant at which this monk is writing, which I'd mentioned before when we were talking about the parchment. So that higher slant to the actual writing surface. So first step, cut the very tip off and soak it in water. This softens the insides. I generally soak overnight or for at least 8 hours. Once the insides are softened, pull the guts out of the feather with a stick or a pointed stick. If you can carve a little hook into it, it makes it easier. When I'm trying to do them quick and dirty, I have like one of those super tiny crochet hooks. Make sure that all the insides of the feather are out before proceeding. If you're having trouble cutting the tip, or if it's making your feather crack or split, try soaking it uncut first, then cut, then soak again. You can try gutting it before you do that second soak, but if things don't come out that way, then you may need to do that second soak. The next step is to cut and strip the feather. Make sure to do this before curing, as it's easier when the feather is wet. Cut the feather down to about the size of a pencil, something that's comfortable to hold, and throw away the top. I know this can be hard for you for your first quill, since so many of us have this vision of a large feather quill. If you want to skip this step, you can, but it will be a little less versatile, though you should probably strip at least the very bottom fluff of the feathers. At some point before curing, you'll also take the blunt side of your knife and scrape off the waxy layer coating the shaft of the feather. Strip the feather by simply pulling the bits off. You can sometimes need to cut them off, and you can use that to trim, but a lot of times once you get it started, it just rips down. You just grab at the top and pull them all the way off at the same time in one strip. But again, touch-ups may be needed. You can leave a bit of feather on the side for brushing away, pounce or bits of, eraser. But if you want it to be in a pinner, you might want to strip all of it. This is at the point where you cure your quill, at least in the way that I do it. It's important to note that this step can be optional. It just means your quills may soften faster during use. It's also possible to have naturally cured feathers to start with before you're even gutting them, and that's okay too. In modern quill cutting classes, we're taught to put it in jeweler's sand in a crock pot that's kept warm but not hot. And you have to leave it in there until the keratin becomes more clear. Alternatively, you can hold it over a hot iron or a stovetop. Another way to do it is to let it heat cure naturally, which is slower. The faster version is, for at least those of us in warmer climates, is to just leave it on your dash for a few days in the middle of the summer, which was definitely intentional and you did not forget it. When preparing quills for an entry, though, I let it cure in the sun outside for a few weeks. This means that I have a lot of uncut cured quills laying around for when I need them. The only documentation specifies curing is hard and clear, so this is really an ambiguous step. Next comes the cutting. The quill is cut in 2 steps, the major cut and minor cut. At least that's what I call them. Terminology may vary. The major cut tapers so that about half of the barrel is cut away. Excuse me. Be wary of guides such as in Lettering and Calligraphy workbook by the diagram group. They do the major and the minor cuts for the reed pen, though they merge the shaping and minor cut into more of like a single step. But they bypass this entirely in their quill walkthrough. That will lead to a lot of frustration with cut quill for broad edge period use. They also tend to cut the slit really early on, which actually should be one of the last steps. You don't have to do the major and minor cuts. You can cut it like just a single slant with the way you would a reed pen, but I've just found they hold up a lot better and they give you cleaner letters if you do the primary and secondary. So the minor cut is further down. This is done to give the pen more balance and support than if it was just the one tapered cut down to the tip, as it can absorb and redirect force applied both from the tip and rotationally. From there, you shape the nib, scraping it on the top and the bottom to sharpen it. Then along the sides, you can actually shape it. As you can see, this pen is cut at a left oblique since that's what was needed for the particular project where I took these pictures. But this is where you can make it any of the shapes that you need. The next step is optional. This picture shows splitting the nib, albeit sloppily. The easiest way to do this is to lay the tip down on your cutting board and press your knife into it from like the inside to the outside and just kind of pop it down that splits it. It doesn't need to be as large as a split as what's depicted. You don't need much at all. My preference is actually to score the nib on both sides. So instead of cutting all the way through, I score it on the back, score it on the outside, score it on the inside. This allows for the ink to flow while letting your tip last a little longer. The third option is to do neither. While I cannot get ink to flow well, some people prefer the method where they don't score or slice at all. All are period practices. Using the quill is not as tricky as you would think. You use it much like a metal nib, but you don't need to bear down as hard. It takes a light touch, like painting, but a little bit less like a rigid paintbrush. After being used for a stretch of time, the quill can re-soften. The best way is to either walk away and leave it be for a while before picking it back up, or use multiple quills, which is likely what they would have done in period. Since I have thus far been unable to ever cut 2 quills exactly the same, I tend to have 1 or 2 projects, each with their own quill, and rotate between them as they begin to soften. This makes getting that period look a lot easier though, because the small flicks, flourishes, etc. are amazingly easier to do than mimicking the look with a metal nib on Bristol board. Any script where you need to twist the nib to get a certain look are also a million times easier with a quill on parchment or perg. It also it's a lot easier on your hands and tons faster, honestly, because you don't have to pick up your pen quite as often. You can do these little dragging motions a lot easier. But most importantly, after you're done using your quill, make sure to clean it and dry it thoroughly to help it last longer. Pen knives are beveled on one side and flat on the other for the most part. They're used primarily for cutting the quill, but also for small trim work on the edges of the page, sometimes scoring, cutting gold for gilding, or sometimes simply holding down the page next to where the work is being done. There's also a trick scribes will use where they hold something in their offhand because the body is weird and it likes to keep you from gripping your pen too tightly if you have something in both hands, which can cause fatigue. Scraping was sometimes a task performed by the penknife, but sometimes a separate, cheaper, or blunter knife was used. It was used to scrape the mistakes from the parchment. If it was a mistake in illumination, it was frequently just scraped, burnished, painted over. However, if it was a mistake where ink or thinner paint needed to go, then the mistake was allowed to dry, the correct line or letter put on top of it and allowed to dry, and then scraped around to remove the unwanted lines. Here are some examples of the Scribal tool dual wielding. And again, note the slant on the work surfaces that they're resting the page on. In instances where you write the wrong letter, let the letters dry, write the new letter on top, let that dry, then you scrape around the new letters, removing any places on the old letters that are poking out. You can then burnish with a smooth stone. For instance, if you wrote Bartholomew instead of Bartholomew, keep writing the scroll, just keep on going, let the mistake letter dry and sit very well. Then you come back to it, write the correct letter on top of the wrong letter. Then once that's fully dried, you just scrape around the edges of the new letter, eliminating what's not needed, which is the red in this example. While some have had some success in scraping Bristol board, I have not. So in those cases, I use a paint that matches my paper, or I grind some of the scrap paper into a pigment, add gum arabic and water, and use the paper to match the paper, which I then paint over whatever's not needed instead of scraping off what's not needed. Though any paint used should be thicker than normal and applied in multiple thin layers that dry in between applications to keep the water from rehydrating it too badly. You can try scraping first, then writing the new letter on top, but I personally don't like the results as much. If you do decide to do this, make sure to burnish before writing the new letters. Note that when the previous scraping example is backlit, you can see some of the striations and marring of the parchment surface. If ink were to go over this, it would feather. So it would likely need to be burnished first, but even then it's not a guarantee it won't feather or spread. A very common black ink was oak gall, such as Palatino's recipe, which uses tannic acid extracted from oak galls, copperas, which is iron 2 sulfate, gum arabic, and some recipes even have pomegranate peel for this nice sheen on it. This is what was used for this scroll. Another common black ink was lamp black. This usually used egg yolk as a binder, but there were a wide array of recipes used in period. Of the lamp black inks, simply lamp black, gum arabic, water is still my favorite, but it's not my favorite ink. I'm a sucker for some oak gall ink. Other ink colors varied widely. A famous red ink is Brazil wood ink, but other popular red inks were used, like lead red or vermilion inks, which was often made a lot like paint, but with a lower ratio of gum arabic and not as thick. The same logic applies to blue ink, lapis, azurite, and the rare examples of other colors like green. In this scroll, I simply used the paint for the red and the orange and the green, and there's more on that later, and I just painted on there to get the letters. So the most common course of action is to find a period script that matches closely, like digging through Harris's Art of Calligraphy, and then determining which script matches the general location and time period of the exemplar, especially in cases where calligraphy is being added to a piece with no exemplar included. If the exemplar included, if there's even an exemplar included, and oftentimes it's just an exemplar on the back of the illumination. So the best option is actually, if you're able to, base the script you use off of the manuscript. So this is done by assessing multiple examples of each letter throughout the page and manuscript and analyzing the letters for various features. We won't get into all of the features to look for because there are literal textbooks on the topic. I even have one specifically about analyzing a specific set of scripts from a specific time period, and it's even without pictures, it'd be like 2 inches thick. So some of the core foundational features to look at, which we'll get into in a little bit more depth in the next few slides, are letter shape, the ratio of the heights of the ascender to the body to the descender, pen angle, and nib thickness. There are sometimes multiple variations of a letter, even within the same manuscript, and even if it's clearly the same person doing the calligraphy, your wrist won't make the same flips the exact same way every time because you are not a robot. Also, be mindful of period grammatical conventions, such as when a tall versus a short S is used, or the fact that sometimes they combine A and E to look like ash, even if the letter ash isn't being used. Honestly, just use your best judgment. If you don't have knowledge of the language at all, or the language idiosyncrasies of that time period, just do your best. If there is a single letter that's written oddly when none other are, and there's no rhyme or reason, you might be looking at a scribe error on the original. Compare the height of the main part of the letter, like the height of an O or an E, to the ascender, like the top part of an H, to the descender, like the bottom part of a G or P. This ratio is very often somewhere in the family of 1 to 2 to 1, ascender to body to descender, but it varies by script. The ratio is also sometimes given based on pen widths proportion. Artificial unseal is notorious for large body ratios and itty bitty ascender and descender ratios. Pen angle is not referring to the angle of the pen perpendicular to the page. Rather, it refers to the angle that the flat of the pen makes in comparison to the baseline. Pen angle is determined by drawing a line through the two thinnest parts of a letter. O is the easiest, marking the angle using the baseline at 0, then inverting it to get the angle that the broad edge retains when marking the letter. You can also use the top line as a reference or just read the inverse angle when you're measuring. While more difficult, it can also be done with the taper points as well without the need for inversion, but I've never gotten really good results from that. Like mine are really off on this one. It's best to do it with multiple letters and determine an average if you can. Most broadhead calligraphy scripts, with very few exceptions for secretary and flourishes, maintain a consistent angle throughout the letter, allowing for a thinner and thicker portion of the letter to taper into each other. While angles vary from script to script and also can depend on your nib type, the general angle, the kind of default, is like 30 to 40 degrees. Modern calligraphy tends to be 45 degrees. This example that I did here with Sharpie on printer paper was 53, but again, in my defense, it was Sharpie on printer paper. Note that the script used in the exemplar for the scroll is in the artificial unseal and insular family, thus it's prone to nib angle changes on things like serifs. These become easier to spot with time. Nib thickness. This is easiest done with a 1-to-1 print off of the exemplar. If you're sizing up or unable to print at 1-to-1, then compare the measurements of the thickest portion of the body measurement along the pen angle. A measurement straight across is not actually the thickest since you write with the pen at an angle, so the line is slightly thinner at that point, so you have to angle it up to get the actual nib width. This will also tell you the number of pen widths and the body ratio, which is an important feature of assuring the script accuracy. And it, of course, if in doubt, play around with it and see what ends up working for you. Here are some of my progress pics for this scroll for the inking and calligraphy portion. Again, starting with the whole scroll for inking. And then some closer up pictures. You can tell the closer up ones were taken before because this one has the O squeezed in there and this one does not. So, paints and pigments. The base ingredients of most paints are going to be pigment, binder, and water. You simply add your materials together and you mold them together. This can be done with a non-porous smooth tile. Glass, for instance, is a cheap source, and a molar, either an actual small molar or even just a smooth bottle cap, as long as it's smooth and flat. This further grinds the pigment and can also serve to mix it with the binder better. While most modern and period pigments, except for like real lapis, you add a ratio about 1:1 powdered gum arabic to pigment, but add more if you find your paint chips off the page easily. Add water to bring the consistency of a heavy whipping cream. If you're finding it's going on the page a little thin, but it's still sticking to the page, okay, add some more pigment. It's just, there's so many factors, and you'll find that balance that works best for you. But when I start, I usually do a 1:1 as my base point. It's also important to note that when you use period pigments, the colors might not match perfectly. They won't be faded the same. They won't have time to interact with other pigments on the page and tinge at the edges, especially with organics. Sometimes as close to period as possible, it still just won't be the same. That is the nature of using pigments. There's an age-old debate when doing a reproduction. Do you paint it how it looks now, or do you paint it how it would have looked when it was made? That decision is often made for you when you use period pigments, because you aren't necessarily color matching unless, like, you use period pigments that have specifically discolored in a similar way. While it may not look exactly like what's on the page, it's important to remember that this is still a period approach, and try not to be discouraged by differences in tone or saturation. We match things to the best of our ability. Sometimes we get it wrong, but that's part of the experimental archaeology. Most manuscripts don't have full mass spec analysis of every pigment on every page, so we take our best guess and then we go from there. Also, note that just because it looks that color on the screen doesn't mean that's the color it looks in real life. Your binder can vary, but the most common are glare and gum arabic. Both are used in period. Glare is made by whipping egg whites and then pulling out you kind of put them at an angle, and it helps the tacky substance settles out from the protein matrix that stays in the whip. So all the thick gunk is left as fluff, and the clearish stuff that runs out can be used as a binder or for gilding, which we are not getting into for this presentation because that's a whole other thing. You can find more information on both gilding and my non-period way to make glare on my website, which I have a link to later on. Gum arabic is a tree gum from Acacia sensoleto, aka mimosa, acacia, thorn tree, or wattle. While a common adage is that gum arabic, aka acacia gum, was only used as a binder for pigments after 1000 CE, leading to the rise of blended shading in the Romanesque era. Detailed analysis of the Book of Duro 780 and Book of Kells 880 by Trinity College Dublin demonstrated that one of the binders used in a lot of those paints was actually gum arabic. So gum arabic was the binder used in this piece since it was contemporary. Cool reds, pinks, and purples are most often in this period derived from kermes, cochineal, and Brazilwood. Brazilwood's known to vary from deep purple to brownish pink, depending on how it's prepared. Kermes refers to all pigments derived from scale insects, and cochineal is named after the specific scale insect, which is Dactylopius coccus, that was often used. Cochineal often varies from bright red to magenta. Magenta is particularly common if that pigment is taken from a fabric dyeing bath dregs and congealed into paint from there. While both are organic pigments, Brazilwood's prepared with vinegar, while cochineal's not, and it fixes the colors a little bit more strongly. This is why it's often known to fade to a pinker tone over time, which is why I went with it for this scroll. The cochineal used in this scroll was prepared from dye dregs obtained at Gulf Wars many, many years ago, and this is actually the last of my stock from that batch of the lake pigment. It's not an uncommon practice for scribes to use the dregs from dyers' vats to use as pigments in manuscripts, and that's how I also got my indigo pigment for this scroll as well. And here's what it looks like on the scroll. I wanted the shield and areas around the fleur-de-lis to be more purple to match the recipient's arm, so I added a very thin overlay of indigo, but it doesn't photograph very well at all. Come on. There we go. Okay, so common warm red pigments included vermilion, madder, and lead red. The exact hue of vermilion can be highly variable depending on preparation, the most common method in period being extracted mercury from its principal ore, cinnabar, to yield mercury to sulfide, HDS, while vermilion tends to darken with age overall. I have noticed it takes on an orange hue in the palette if it goes through too many rehydration cycles. Madder, a dye derived from rubiaceae roots, can have an orange undertone depending on how it's prepared. Lead red, which is lead 2,4 oxide, Pb3O4, often takes on an whoa, hey, what'd you do? There we go. All right, so where was I? Increasing orange tone over time. For the lead red. Another red pigment used in contemporary manuscripts was red ochre. It's naturally occurring iron 3 oxide hematite, Fe2O3. However, this was most commonly used as a base for gold leaf in my experience. I used madder, but in retrospect, it may have been more likely to be lead red, as that's been a commonly identified pigment in other contemporary works. However, the pigment on the page has an almost washed looking quality to it, which could indicate the dye base matter instead of a metal pigment base. So it's still debatable which was used in that specific section of the exemplar. I had a pic. Oh yeah, here it's on the slide. It was doing weird things for me. I apologize. So that's my pitiful quantity of dried matter. That's all I had left. It would not have been sufficient for this scroll. To supplement, I combined dry faux vermilion and a yellow ochre I had recently made, ensuring the final color remained true to the color of pure prepared matter paint, and I actually ended up getting relatively close. And here's what it looked like on the scroll. It photographs super, super orange, but it also depends on the light, and you'll see that in the original, in the exemplars as well. A common green pigment used throughout the Middle Ages was terra verte, but that has an earthier tone than seen in the exemplar. The color also didn't match blackthorn, which is derived from Rhamnus and Frangula species berries, which is also often known as sap green. The color looks like it could have been either verdigris or malachite. Verdigris is copper salt of acetic acid, and the balance of blue and green depends on the exact chemical composition. But copper 2 acetate monohydrate is often believed to result in the more typical blue-green blend, while bluer tones are more associated with a slightly different chemical structure, and it's kind of like a natural verdigris salt. Also often cited as being brochantite, and there are many others depending on the use and composition. It's the same thing that gives copper, bronze, and brass statues their distinctive green color when they form a patina on the surface. I did eventually decide to use malachite, since that was used in both Book of Kells and Book of Duro. Malachite's a mineral pigment derived from basic copper carbonate. And I also chose it because I had a malachite that turned a little blue, a little more blue than I normally like, which matched well enough, and because I didn't have verdigris. But in retrospect, it was probably verdigris or a mixed malachite, as mine came out rather dark, and malachite doesn't tend to fade the way it was in the exemplar due to it being a mineral pigment instead of a chemical one. Orpiment, arsenic sulfide. This was one of the more common brighter tone yellows. Yellow ochre was also often used, but it has a darker and browner tone than what was seen in the exemplar. The yellow in the exemplar had a very faded and wash-like look, so I originally thought it might be weld or myrobalan, but looking at contemporary works, I decided a thin orpiment was most likely. One of the most famous blue pigments is lapis, and also almost always occurs with vast impurities of calcspar and iron pyrites, and various methods were developed to extract the pure ultramarine from the impurities, the purest form being almost exclusively just like the specific chemical compound for that versus having all the impurities. After initial processing, the first batch of extract was the most vibrant color, and all subsequent batches kind of got grayer and grayer, so it was less and less pure. These less pure ultramarines were used for shading effects rather than mixing the mineral with a lime or a lead white. However, the most common blue pigments in contemporary pieces for the exemplar I was using were azurite and indigo. Azurite is a hydrated copper carbonate. However, based on the color tone for the piece, the color used was most assuredly indigo. Indigo is extracted from Indigofera species. From the leaves, and it gets a characteristic color from indigotin. The indigo used on this scroll was prepared from dye dregs obtained at Gulf Wars 2025. As with kermes, it was not an uncommon practice for scribes to use the dregs from dye vats to use as pigments in manuscripts. The excess water was slowly evaporated out, leaving a more paint-like consistency. I then added a small amount of gum arabic to a portion of the liquid for binder. Eventually, it was all dried out and just used as any other pigment. Lead white is one of the more ubiquitous white pigments used in period, though gypsum was also used. Gypsum's calcium sulfate mineral and was the primary white used in Book of Kells. There are many other contemporary examples using lead white, which is what I use since I already owned lead white. The lead white pigment I used is purchased from a company, Natural Pigments, that uses the same Dutch stacking method used in period, where strips or slabs of lead were hung or stacked above a large vase of vinegar or urine. They use vinegar, which was sealed for an extended period of time, and then the white particulates that would form on the outside of the metal were scraped off, which produces the white pigment. This produces larger particles and a higher size variability than modern methods, composed of approximately 70% lead carbonate and 30% lead hydrate, collectively referred to as dibasic lead carbonate or lead 2 carbonate. And again, here's the color from on the page. Same one as the orpiment indigo and lead white. Toxic pigments are the most dangerous when they are powdered, as they are easily rendered airborne, where they then stick to mucosal membranes to enter the bloodstream. However, as long as you are safe, you handle indirectly or you wear gloves, you mix the paint in a well-ventilated but not windy area, and don't lick your brushes, they are perfectly okay to work with. For adults, there's usually only a danger with large doses or long-term exposure, though there is some danger for pets and children. So just keep them in a safe place, both dry and ones mixed. I have links to all of the common toxic pigments and all the ones discussed in this presentation, so let me know if you want links. Fisher Sci has a great database of material safety data sheets, MSDS, also known as safety data sheets, SDS, which let me just drop that link in the comments because I have that link easily and readily available. So that's a good site to search for things. If you are interested in artisan safety, please stick around for the class following this one at 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern, titled Dangerous Beauty, Hazards in Medieval Arts and Sciences. Okay, part 2, layout and design for SCA uses. There are many reasons to want to substitute period materials with modern or alternative period materials. The biggest considerations tend to be safety, cost, and accessibility. Parchment is about $35 for a single 11x14 sheet at the absolute cheapest. That's who I get it from, but it easily ranges to $100 for a single sheet. Pergaminata is about $20 for a 20 pack of heavyweight. It's a artificial vegetable base to mimic parchment. Bristol board's about $15 to $20 for a book of like 25 to 50 sheets. Bristol boards is common for production level scribal work, as well as more expensive papers that are just they're just not sustainable, but it's less not sustainable than parchment. Pergaminata tends to be the go-to surface for a surface that's similar to parchment at a fraction of the cost. It's burnished vegetable-based material instead of fiber paper, so it behaves similarly to the parchment. And all the techniques for working on parchment by and large, also apply to working on pergaminata. Pounce isn't dangerous or expensive, but it can be difficult to produce, especially without access to a suitable fireplace. You can use chalk instead if you like. I personally hate working with it. Sometimes scribes will use an eraser, like a high polymer white eraser, to prep the surface of the parchment or the pergaminata by, just erasing all over the surface to remove oil and debris. It's also generally less messy than using Pounce. An eraser is doubly accessible since scribes will already have one available regardless of what surface they're using. Most scribes will use a pencil instead of a stylus. A lead tin stylus becomes difficult to use with a higher tin content and potentially dangerous to use with the proper lead ratios. They're also not easy to find. I have only found a few vendors that sell lead tin styluses with the modern tin heavy ratio, and only one who even advertises a period ratio that I've only ever been able to privately order them at SCA events. The best tip for modern pencils is to use a 0.5 or 0.3 size lead, as it'll keep you from bearing too heavy-handed. It's especially important on Bristol board, where those heavy lines become increasingly difficult to erase. For people who want to use quills but don't have access to goose feathers, craft store turkey feathers are a cheap modern alternative, though feathers that have been dyed or bleached should be avoided, as that can mess with the cutting process and interact poorly with ink. The most ubiquitous substitution for quills are modern broad edge nibs. They don't flow the same on the same way on the page as quills as quills do on parchment, but they are accessible. They're relatively cheap, and they make it easy to switch between different sizes. Different nibs have different levels of rigidity and sharpness, so calligraphers, you have to pay attention to what can affect the shape of your letters. They also have a tendency to dig into the page, especially if you're working with fiber-based surface versus pergaminata or parchment. While all calligraphy should involve pulling the pen across the page and not pushing the flat edge against the page, there are some secretary scripts that involve twists and pushes that are extremely difficult to accomplish with metal nib on Bristol board as compared to a quill on parchment. Almost every scribe uses modern brushes. I have made them and found them tedious, so I don't use them or make them anymore. There are many options among modern brushes that use fibers and shapes that closely mirror what was used in period. Period brushes aren't too different from modern natural brushes. They had a wood handle. Other handles in period were made with a variety of woods like ash, oak, etc. So really any dowels can be used for this. Then the fiber is kind of bent over and bound in the middle. I use sinew. And then after you fold it over, you bind it again. You kind of wrap it around to help hold the fold. And then it's held into place by the ferrule often made from a feather shaft. So the feather shaft is soaked to swell, and then you shove the fiber in and then the stick in, and as it dries, it'll tighten. I tend to use a quill that's been sharpened repeatedly, and I'm like, this doesn't have much life left as a quill that lasts a little bit. I'll turn it into the ferrule. The most frequently specific fibers mentioned is miniver, ermine, but I've used goat, horse, sable, a couple other natural fibers as well. So yeah, sometimes I will use sinew around the ferrule as well if it's needed, just to help keep it tight on there. Many people opt to use modern paints instead of using period pigments. The most common concerns are safety. A few pigments are mild to moderate toxins, and also price and accessibility. Pigment, even modern ones, are not always cheap and not always easy to get a hold of. In Meridiers, we have a preference for people using gouache paint if you're going to use a modern one. It's an opaque watercolor that acts remarkably similar to a basic pigment plus water plus gum Arabic combination. While period pigments mixed with glare are often compared to acrylics, they're not really preferred for Meridian production Scribal, as they tend to chip in the giant cases of scrolls as they wait to go out to the recipients. If an acrylic is the only option, please consider soft-bodied acrylics to negate some of that issue, but mind that adhesion is best on Bristol board when you're using those as compared to pergaminata or parchment. We will often try to size the scroll to match the exemplar, unless, or generally match the exemplar, unless bigger is better for visual interest or recipient desires. But scribes still must be considerate that the recipients will need to frame the scrolls, or you will frame it before you give it. Bespoke framing is extremely costly, so most default to US standard or your local standard frame sizes, often adjusting for the sizing from the exemplar to fall within one of the dimensions and then tweaking as needed. The most common sizes in Meridiers are 5x7, 8x10, there's a few 8.5x11, 9x12, and 11x14. It is also difficult to frame side-by-side pages of a scroll, so many scribes will opt to have the verso and recto depictions on a single bigger sheet, like what I did. This can also throw off ratios and proportions as compared to the period exemplar. Some mats are available in sizes like 4x6 and 5x7 for 2 pictures to go together, but they're not always readily available. This also means that margins and page alignment are shifted to allow for framing as well. There are grammatical differences between modern and period that can affect a scroll's layout and design. One of the most obvious is that certain letters didn't exist. Some scribes will use a faux hand to compensate, like an I with a descender added becomes the non-existent J, or simply using a period alternative, like doing U and U instead of a W. It really depends on the letter, the script, and ultimately what the scribe and recipient both prefer. Conventions regarding capitalization have changed. Some scripts only like the I in Jesus is capitalized. Sometimes it's only the initial. Sometimes it's only very specific proper nouns. This contradicts with our modern conventions of sentence start capitalization of vast array of proper nouns. There are multiple ways to address this. One is to just simply not capitalize at all unless it's part of the elimination, which is the tactic that I used. Another is to write lowercase, just make it bigger or add some paint or dots or both. This is especially common for scripts where there's no defined uppercase. There's really no wrong answer for this one, but it can affect layout. For instance, if you want to use Book of Kells style where the initials are all off to like the left side, that means you need to line up your words and phrasing such that the capital letter can fall there regularly with proper spacing without looking strange. Another convention with modern and later period writing is that if you don't have enough room for the next word on the line, then you skip down to the next line to start it. Often in period, they just simply go to the end of the line and then cut off the word in half and then just pick up on the next line without using a dash or other punctuation to indicate it. This is what was used for this scroll, and it's my preferred method. Another period method was the use of line enders, which is a great technique to use on scrolls, but it can be too time consuming for production level Scribal or last minute filling in of scroll blanks. I hold that it's important to match the alignment on the original and try to keep the justified edge if that's what the exemplar used, but your mileage may vary. For the pretty illuminated pages that we like to use for scrolls, a lot of the period text was very large and decorative. This is another reason you will find 2-page scrolls where there's an illumination on the left and text on the right. But if you want to incorporate it, there are several considerations. First, you need room for scroll text, and Meridiers is verbose. You also need room for the crown signature and or seals. Sometimes this makes removing some of the smaller illumination details necessary to make it look less busy with the new squished words in there. While my calligraphy sizing was only a tad smaller than the exemplar, I decreased the ascender to descender and spacer size to allow for more room. Another workaround is to incorporate secretary scripts and glossing. In this scroll, I got most of the way through the scroll text before realizing I would not have enough room to finish the scroll text. Because of this, I decided to leave it off at the nice clean line end, and it was the end of an idea. Skip to the signatures, and then use a small, more compact secretary script to fill out the date and minutia. And when I say secretary, I don't mean the classification of later period secretary scripts. I mean a bookhand. So this was an insular minuscule that is being used in it like a notation. It could have been made later. For this scroll, I also removed some smaller illumination details to make it less busy with the new squished words in there. I removed the dots on the cross since the bulky stacked letters, which is a perfectly period way of doing block letters, looked less crowded. I also squished the letters next to the D to make room for a first and last name, the placement of which was determined by the D and apostrophe already being in the exemplar. I've also done the first line of a scroll one size, only to realize that it's entirely too large, so I switched down for every line after that. This is an entirely documentable practice. I've used a faux gloss where I added red calligraphy and a tiny, Secretary of Buchan contemporary or significantly later to either match or denote later study, respectively, to look like translations or notes when it's actually just giving more scroll text. There are a lot of ways around things, but they usually involve messing with some of the period aesthetic to get everything on the page that's needed. One of the most common deviations from period design and motif will be to add or change things to personalize the piece for the details of the recipient, both as references to the individual's activities, inside jokes, heraldry, meridian award badges, etc. This can also, and often does, include changing colors as well, particularly seen with this scroll with the heavier use of indigo over the madder to get a more purple color, which is both a preferred color and part of their arms. I also didn't shy away from the bold colors that give it a Mardi Gras vibe, since this is actually probably the level of vibrancy in the original, and I knew the recipient would appreciate it. You can also see I changed the hanging W fish to O to reference part of the recipient's name, though I left the A to reference their mundane first name. I added the awards already bestowed, Pelican, Rose, County, Duchy, Argent Lily, and Ovo in the columns, along with elements of her arms. Then in the cross, I added her meridian cross, quill, guiding hand, and lymphad to represent her Brenmatic awards. So you can always squeeze in the teeny tiny details. At the bottom of the columns, I incorporated the first initials of her family members, as well as more elements from her arms. I removed some illumination to give a cleaner look. I knew the recipient would prefer, like we discussed before, with me removing some of the dots and more squished elements. I added her arms, which I will need to eventually add the 3 stars to, hence the Latin on the back, Tibi Tria Astra Debeo. I owe you 3 stars. I also added a bunch of hidden Mickeys, since I knew that's something that the recipient would especially enjoy. And I had so many opportunities to do so. So there, and there, there, like all throughout the calligraphy in the crown's name. The crown thought it was hilarious. Please note that I know the crowns, and I knew they would 100% be on board with me altering their signatures. Your mileage may vary, and if in doubt, double check. Common change, which I made twice here, is to remove or downplay liturgical aspects. In this scroll, I truncated both crosses to match period decorative and heraldic motifs, not necessarily as closely associated with Christianity as the original crosses with the longer bottom portions. It also gave me more room to work with. Incorporating the recipient's name also has to be incorporated into the design. One of the reasons I chose this page was because the D initial was already in place, aligning perfectly with the recipient's last name, though I had to add additional block letters for the first and remove some of the lowercase wording to make room. The centering is not in keeping with period aesthetic, but on scrolls, for the cases, a long line is included to be more accommodating for a variety of names. And if there's not time for line enders and the like, then centering looks best. The SCA isms will absolutely change the period aesthetics, but it's all part of the creative aspect of the Society for Creative Anachronism. Since I made adjustments to personalize some of the details for the recipient, a common feature, of SCA Scrolls, I couldn't simply copy the color blocking. I did for a lot of it, but the areas that I changed, I had to tweak where the colors were. This was also made difficult by my resizing to conform to SCA modern sizing needs, which necessitated the removal of some details. To plan out the color blocking better without having to do it while actively painting, I tried something new, took a picture of the line scroll, and then I converted it to black and white in Word. Then I printed that off, and I was able to battle plan what colors would go where, both based on the original as well as my edits. So this way I could visualize color placement without putting paint to page. I also align colors in a way that both fit the original design and still flowed with the edits I'd made to go with badges, things like that. Okay, conclusion. The shortest part of this presentation. In adapting period scroll making techniques for modern SCA practices, scribes must balance historical authenticity with practical considerations such as cost, safety, accessibility, and the needs of the recipient. By substituting materials like parchment with permanganate or Bristol board, using pencils in place of styluses, and selecting modern paints and brushes, artists can achieve period adjacent results without compromising on functionality or sustainability. These substitutions make Scribal work more approachable for a broader community while preserving the visual and structural integrity of medieval manuscripts. Modern scribes also tailored their designs to contemporary constraints, including standard framing sizes, personalized heraldic details, and the spacing required for extensive SCA scroll text. Adaptations in grammar, letter forms, layout, and sizing are frequently necessary to convey the desired message while maintaining visual harmony. Personal touches, such as recipient-specific motifs, hidden elements, or modernized illuminations, reflect the creative spirit of the Society for Creative Anachronism while honoring its historical foundation. Ultimately, these thoughtful compromises between period accuracy and modern needs ensure that the scroll remain meaningful, accessible, and still artistically rich. In my opinion, they embody the artistry inherent in the many disciplines within the SCA, celebrating both the past and the present through intentional, informed artistry. So before you ask, yes, I am going to drop a link. Oh, yes, I just saw the chat. Yeah, a lot of the pigment sellers have the MSDS on their website. So link to a copy of the slides is in the comments. Yes, I already have this typed up as a paper, and I will be linking that as well. It's in that folder along with the raw images included in the paper. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question but don't want your voice on the class recording, feel free to drop it in chat instead. Okay, questions, comments, or anything folks would like to discuss, the floor is open.
I never knew that the recycling of the dye vats was, or the dyes from the dye vats was one of the ways that you could get your pigments.
Yeah, like it's purely documentable too, and that's why we have like 8 jars in our house.
Wonderful. I've been wondering why that was the case.
Yep, and it's period, so you had to put up with it. So yeah, do you have anything? I'm gonna put you on the spot because I can.
Questions or like comments?
Yes.
I'm actually surprised you do a 1-to-1 ratio with your gum arabic and pigment.
Really? What do you do?
I know I use I know I use whiting chalk, but I use a 6:3:1 ratio.
Really?
Yeah, which I know a couple of other people also use that.
I never got the 6:3:1 to work for me.
Yeah, I tell people like I start with the 6:3:1, and then sometimes it works fine, but you know sometimes it's the middle of summer and nothing wants to work, and you just have to keep adjusting.
Okay, now I've got a question. 6:3:1.
6 parts pigment, 3 parts gum arabic, 1 part whiting chalk.
Okay.
Calcium carbonate or whiting chalk, or you could even use lead white if you are already using lead.
Okay.
But that's also, I'm often always at least putting a little bit more water to make it easier to mix. So
I do
I
tend
think
to
we could-
like stir in the gum, like chop in, like cut in the gum arabic with the pigment before I add the water, because I find that it keeps that gum arabic from clumping. I know Veronica, she'll actually mix her gum arabic with her water in advance and then drop that onto the pigment and just mix it straight like that.
Yeah, I use a gum arabic solution like she does. So it's mostly, mostly water, but I'm also trying to use the gum arabic flakes
Mm-hmm.
now instead of the powder,
powder.
because it was a lot more sticky when I did it that way.
That's good to know.
Yeah. And also I can control what color the gum arabic was.
Mm.
I have a question regarding making brushes.
Yeah.
You had listed horsehair and goat hair. Like what? Like for the would it be the tail? Would it be just the body hair? Would it be the like where or the goat? Like what parts?
So it depends, which is the worst answer I know. But really what it depends on is the length. You want it, see, probably it depends on how long you want your brush. But if you want your brush to end up at like half an inch after cutting, you'll need like 2 inches of hair, because it gets folded over and then it gets shoved into the ferrule and then it gets trimmed as well. So most horsehair from the body is not long enough. So it is just like a few strands of a tail hair will, especially like those longer, the breeds that have the longer tails and manes. Don't pluck it off of horses, clip it, or use stuff that is shed. And then even one strand gets you a pretty decent brush for the tiny brushes, which is mostly what I use, is tiny brushes. Now, something I forgot to mention, but something to note, is that when you cut a paintbrush, I don't know if y'all have ever cut a modern paintbrush to try to make it pointier by cutting outside in and trying to make it pointier, and then suddenly it's not working. That's because you cut them opposite. So if you want less at the tip, you cut the internal fibers, so the external forms like this casing around it.
Oh.
So it's a pain, and I don't like to do it, so I don't. You want a scribe to be, hold on, it just charged for cutting somebody else's horse's tail. That'd be some fun court shtick right there.
No, I have a couple of friends that have horses, and I'm not sure if they still have goats, but they have. So I'm gonna ask her.
Yep. Just be like, hey, can I have a few? Another thing that you don't pluck off of an animal but can be used for very fine lines for things like white work. Something that I like to use is cat whiskers, because they do shed them naturally. Please, for the love of God, do not cut or pluck cat whiskers. But it's this nice, rigid, basically like single strand paintbrush, and that's easy to hold. And I use that for white work on very, very tiny bar and ivy illumination a lot as well.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do they ever use peach gum as a binder?
Not that I have found, but honestly, if it was readily available and it was a sap that could be stored easily and then rehydrated to make a sticky substance, I see no reason not to. For like things like ANS entries, whenever I do make those kind of deviations, I'll say like, look, here's this one species of tree that I'm using that is not acacia. It was around in the area that this manuscript's from. It forms a resin that's similar to this, this, and this, and here's how they're similar, and here's how they're different. And they probably would have used this instead of importing acacia gum when they had this tree right here that had all of this beautiful resin. So, like, if the tree was available, they probably would have. But the problem is that there's not a lot of surviving examples that say what gum they're using. And all the ones that I have found so far have specified acacia gum. But there's also sometimes the issue of they'll just all call it acacia gum, even if it's not acacia. So, I mean, maybe. I haven't found primary documentation for that, but that doesn't mean it's not possible.
I've heard that it was used in Chinese paint.
Mm.
I've never really found much of it.
Well, that's another rabbit hole. I'll add that onto the pile of rabbit holes I have. Oh, lead tin stylus. Where did you get that? Oh gosh, where did I get it? Oh man, that was eons ago. I think
I
it
mean,
was just.
I had to get mine from Italy. So,
I
but
think I got mine from John Neal Books when I got to gallivant through their warehouse. You can, yeah, they're finding you're starting to see more and more pop up, but honestly, just crow quill from EU. Oh gosh, basically just look for random Etsy sellers that sell like crow skulls and like all the spooky gothic stuff or gothy stuff, and then they'll usually have like a bunch of spare crow feathers, and if they have any other crow stuff, you can that you can usually message them, be like, hey, do you have crow feathers as well that you can't get rid of? I will buy them off of you. And they'll be like, yes, for the love of God. So yeah, just look for like spooky stuff and like gothy stuff. But honestly, Etsy, that's usually where I get them. I just go on Etsy and find out who is selling crow feathers from the UK.